My name is Claire. I am 34 years old. I have spent the last 9 years working in real estate law, which means I know what a lockbox on a door handle means, what a listing agreement looks like when it is printed and left face down on a kitchen counter, and exactly how long it takes to transfer a property title once the paperwork has been filed. I know these things the way a surgeon knows anatomy, not because I find them interesting, but because knowing them is how I do my job. I tell you this now because the afternoon my mother called to say she and my father wanted me to come to the lake house for the weekend, to reconnect, her word. I had no reason to think any of that knowledge would matter. I thought I was going to spend 2 days on a porch by the water with people I had not fully forgiven but still loved in the complicated way you love people who shaped you badly. I was wrong about why I was going. And when I pulled into that gravel driveway on a Friday afternoon in September and saw the woman in the blazer standing on the dock with a camera and a measuring tape, I understood in about 4 seconds what was actually happening. The problem for my family was that I had understood things like this for a living for 9 years, and the problem for that woman in the blazer was that she was standing on property that had not belonged to my parents for 11 months. If you have ever walked into a room where everyone expected you to be lost, and you were the only one who knew where you were, stay with me. This is that story. Before I go any further, if this is your first time here, please take a moment to subscribe and drop a comment telling me where you are watching from. I read every single one. And if you have ever had a family member treat something that belonged to you like it was already theirs, tell me about it below. Now let me take you back to where this started. I grew up in a family that was comfortable in the way that teaches children the wrong lessons. Not wealthy, but comfortable. A 4-bedroom house in a suburb of Columbus, 2 cars in the driveway, a lake house in Michigan that my grandparents had built in 1971 and passed to my parents when my grandfather died. I was 11 when they inherited it. I remember the summer after the funeral, sitting on the dock with my grandmother Ruth while my parents were inside talking to the estate lawyer. She put her hand over mine on the wood planking and said something I wrote down that night in the journal I kept under my mattress. She said, "This place holds everyone who ever loved each other here. Don't let them trade it for something smaller." I was 11. I did not know what she meant by something smaller. My parents are not cruel people. I want to be fair about that. My father, Robert, managed a regional distribution company for 30 years. My mother, Sandra, taught middle school English until she retired at 62. They worked. They tried. But there was always a current running underneath our family that I only learned to name much later in therapy. The current was this. Whatever I built was available to them if they needed it. Not because they were greedy, because they had never fully understood that I was a separate person with a separate life. To them, my resources were family resources. My income was family income. My professional connections were family connections. And my grandmother's house, the one she had whispered to me about on that dock when I was 11, was in their mind theirs to do with as they saw fit. The first time I understood the current, I was 26. I had just passed the bar and started my position at Hartwell & Associates, a mid-size real estate law firm in Chicago. I had been there 4 months when my father called on a Sunday evening. He explained that the lake house needed a new roof and new windows, and the dock had 3 rotted boards, and the total estimate was around $40,000. He explained that their savings were committed to other things. He did not ask. He said, "We figured you could handle this since you're doing so well now." I paid it. Not because I wanted to, because the lake house was where my grandmother had held my hand on the dock, and I could not bear the thought of it falling apart. I told myself it was love. It took me several more years to understand it was something else. That pattern continued for the next several years, in smaller and larger amounts. A medical bill here, a car repair there, my brother Daniel's failed restaurant, which I co-signed a loan for against my own professional judgment, and which closed 14 months later with $60,000 of debt that my parents assured me they would help cover, and never did. Each time the current pulled, and I let it. Each time the family framing was the same. We are a family. Families help each other. You are doing well. You have more than enough. What changed was not a single moment. It was a year. I turned 31, and I sat down with my therapist, and I described the pattern out loud for the first time, without justifying any of it. She listened to the whole thing without interrupting. When I finished, she said, "How much has this cost you in the last decade?" I had never added it up. I added it up that week. The number was significant enough that I did not tell anyone what it was. I just put it in a spreadsheet and sat with it for a long time. I stopped saying yes without thinking. I started saying, "I need to look at my situation and get back to you," which I had learned from years of legal practice is the most useful sentence a person can say when they are being asked to commit to something they have not reviewed. Sometimes I called back and said yes. Sometimes I called back and said no. The no's were hard. They produced what my family called distance, which was their word for the 6-month period when calls became less frequent and holiday invitations became shorter, and everyone was politely civil in the way that people are when they are waiting for something to go back to normal. Normal, in my family, meant me saying yes. Now let me tell you about the lake house and what my grandmother did 11 months before that September Friday. My grandmother Ruth died 3 years ago at 84. She had been in declining health for 2 years, and I had driven to Michigan 4 times during that period to sit with her, help manage her medications, coordinate with her doctors, and review her legal documents because she had asked me specifically to do that. She trusted me with the paperwork of her life in a way she did not trust my parents, and she was clear-eyed enough about why that I never had to ask. In one of our last real conversations, about 8 months before she died, she asked me to bring my laptop to her kitchen table. She had a folder already out. Inside were the original deed to the lake house, tax records going back 20 years, and a handwritten list of questions in her small, precise cursive. She said, "I want to put the house somewhere safe before I go. I want you to tell me how to do that." I told her about revocable living trusts. I explained how a property could be transferred into a trust during her lifetime, that the trust would name a successor trustee who would control the property after she passed, and that this structure would allow her to specify exactly what happened to the house and exactly who had authority over it. I explained that a trust of this kind, once recorded, meant the property no longer passed through her estate in the traditional sense. It could not be redirected by a will or contested easily in probate. It went where she said it went. She listened to everything. Then she asked me one question. "If I put it in a trust and I name you as the successor trustee, can your parents sell it without your agreement?" I said no. She said good. Then she said, "Schedule the appointment." I referred her to a colleague at a firm I trusted in Grand Rapids because I could not be her attorney directly, given our family relationship. His name was Thomas Vella. He was thorough, patient, and had been doing estate work for 30 years. Over the following 6 weeks, my grandmother transferred the lake house into the Ruth Eleanor Marsh Revocable Living Trust. She named herself as trustee during her lifetime. She named me as successor trustee. The deed was recorded with the county on a Tuesday in October. The property had a value at that point of approximately $410,000 based on comparable sales in the area. My parents were not told. My grandmother looked at me across her kitchen table after we had reviewed the final recorded documents, and she said, "They will be angry." I said, "I know." She said, "They will say I went around them." I said, "You did." She smiled. She said, "Yes, I did." Then she picked up her tea. She died 4 months later, on a Thursday morning in February. I was in Chicago. My father called at 7:45. I drove to Michigan that afternoon. At the funeral, I sat in the second row and held the order of service and thought about the doc and the things she had said when I was 11. Don't let them trade it for something smaller. She had made sure they couldn't. The estate process was straightforward from a legal standpoint because the lake house was already in the trust and therefore outside the probate estate entirely. My parents inherited her personal property and her remaining bank accounts, which were modest. The lake house passed to my management as successor trustee, according to the trust terms. Thomas Vella filed the necessary paperwork. The county recorded the successor trustee designation. I was now legally and solely responsible for the property. I told my parents this approximately 3 weeks after the funeral. I explained it carefully and without drama. I told them the house was in a trust, that my grandmother had set it up while she had capacity, and with proper legal counsel, that I was the successor trustee, and that decisions about the property were now mine to make according to the trust terms. My mother was quiet for a long time. Then she said, she went around us. I said, she made a legal decision about her own property. My father said, we are her children. I said, I know. There was not much more to say. The months that followed were what my family called difficult, and what I called predictable. My mother stopped calling as regularly. My father was polite but thin in a way that communicated injury. My brother Daniel, who had never had any particular relationship with the lake house and whose failed restaurant I had co-signed, told me through a mutual cousin that he thought what my grandmother had done was unfair. I did not respond. Then, 6 months after my grandmother's death, something shifted. My mother's calls became warmer. My father asked how work was going, with genuine, apparent interest. In August, my mother suggested a weekend at the lake house, just the 4 of us, your father and I, and you, and maybe Daniel, if he can make it. She said the word reconnect. She said it was time to put the difficult months behind them. She said she missed me, and she missed the house, and she thought it would be healing for everyone. I said I would think about it. I thought about it for 2 weeks. I said yes. I said yes because I was the trustee of the property, and I had the right to use it, and because some part of me still wanted the version of my family that sat on docks and held hands and meant it. I drove up on a Friday. The drive from Chicago to the lake takes about 4 hours. I spent most of it listening to a legal podcast I had been working through on easement disputes, which tells you something about the kind of person I am on a Friday afternoon. I pulled off the highway around 3 and took the county roads through the trees. The lake house appeared at the end of a gravel driveway, the way it always had. The same white siding, the same screened porch, the dock extending into the water at the bottom of the slope. And on the dock, 30 feet from the water's edge, was a woman I did not know. She was wearing a blazer. She had a camera with a wide-angle lens hanging from her neck. She was holding a tablet and consulting it, then looking at the property, then making notes. On the dock railing beside her was a collapsible measuring wheel, the kind used to calculate square footage and lot dimensions. I sat in my car with the engine off for approximately 60 seconds. I knew what she was doing. I had done what she was doing for clients. She was documenting the property for a listing. She was preparing to put the lake house on the market. I got out of the car. My parents were inside. I could see them through the screen door before I knocked. My mother was at the kitchen counter, and my father was sitting at the table with what appeared to be a folder of papers. He closed it when he heard me on the steps. I came in. My mother hugged me with the particular warmth of someone who needs something. My father stood and shook my hand and smiled the smile of a man who had rehearsed the next several hours and was ready to begin. "Hi, sweetheart. How was the drive?" "Fine." "Who is the woman on the dock?" A pause. Half a second. The half second that people take when the script has gone off its intended sequence. My mother said, "Oh, she is just doing a quick assessment. We thought it might be good to have an updated valuation." I set my bag on the kitchen floor. I looked at the folder my father had closed. I said, "Evaluation for what purpose?" My mother looked at my father. My father said, "Why don't we sit down?" I said I would rather stand. Here is what they told me over the next 20 minutes, sitting at my grandmother's kitchen table, where she had taught me to organize documents and had asked me how to protect the house. They told me that they had been struggling financially since my father's retirement 2 years earlier. They told me that their pension was smaller than expected and that they had drawn down their savings. They told me that the lake house represented a significant asset that was, in their words, just sitting there. They told me that Daniel's restaurant debt, the $60,000 I had co-signed, had created additional pressure because I had never fully pursued collection, and they had never fully repaid. They told me they had spoken to a real estate agent named Karen Whitfield, who was currently on the dock, and that Karen had told them comparable properties in the area were selling for between $400,000 and $450,000. I picked up my bag from the floor. I unzipped the front pocket and I took out my laptop. I opened it on my grandmother's kitchen table and I navigated to the county recorder's public database, which I knew how to search because I had been searching county recorder databases for 9 years. I found the property by parcel number in approximately 45 seconds. I turned the screen to face them. The deed showed the Ruth Eleanor Marsh Revocable Living Trust as the owner of record, recorded 14 months earlier. Successor trustee listed as Claire Marsh, which is my name. I said, "The house is in a trust. It has been for over a year. I am the trustee. You cannot list it, sell it, or encumber it without my written authorization as trustee." Karen Whitfield does not have a listing agreement that is legally enforceable because the person who signed it has no authority to sign it. My mother's face went through several expressions quickly enough that I couldn't say I'll not name all of them. My father stared at the screen. He said, "Your grandmother did this." I said, "Yes." He said, "She went around us." I said, "She made a legal decision about her own property while she had full capacity and with proper legal counsel. The same thing I told you 3 weeks after the funeral." My mother said, "You knew about this." I said, "I referred her to the attorney. I was not her counsel directly. But yes, I knew." The screen door opened. Karen Whitfield came up the slope from the dock with her tablet and her camera and her professional smile, and she stepped into the kitchen and stopped when she read the room. She looked at my father. She looked at my mother. She looked at me. I turned to her and I said, "I am the successor trustee of the property you are currently documenting. Do you have a signed listing agreement?" She said she had a signed authorization form. I said, "Who signed it?" She said, "Mr. and Mrs. Marsh." I said, "Mr. and Mrs. Marsh are not the owners of record and do not have authority to authorize a listing. You can confirm this through the county recorder. I can give you the parcel number if that helps." Karen Whitfield looked at my mother. My mother looked at the table. Karen Whitfield said, "I think I need to make some calls." She went back outside. The kitchen was very quiet. I closed my laptop. I put it back in my bag. I looked at my parents, my father who had closed the folder when he heard me on the steps, my mother who had used the word reconnect. I said, "When did you contact Karen Whitfield?" My father said, 2 months ago. 2 months ago. While the warmer calls were starting. While my father was asking about work with genuine, apparent interest. While my mother was suggesting a weekend at the lake house to reconnect. I said, "This weekend was never about reconnecting." My mother started to speak. I said, "I am not angry. I want to be clear about that. I am not surprised either. I am just going to tell you what happens now." I stayed that night. Not because the evening was comfortable. It was not. But the house was mine to manage, and I had driven 4 hours, and I had nothing to prove by leaving dramatically. I made dinner from what was in the refrigerator. My parents ate quietly. My father cleared the plates. My mother went to bed early. I sat on the dock until 10. The water was flat and dark, and the trees on the far shore were just shapes. I thought about my grandmother sitting in this same spot, and I thought about the document she had made me help her create. And I thought about how much of love is just preparation, knowing something bad is coming, and quietly making it harder for the bad thing to succeed. The next morning over coffee, I said what I had come to say. I told them I understood they were struggling. I told them I believed that was true, and I was not dismissing it. I told them I would sit down with a financial planner with them if they wanted that. I told them I would review their situation honestly and help them find options that did not involve selling the only place my grandmother had ever felt was fully hers. I told them the house was not available. Not to Karen Whitfield, not to the developer, not to anyone. Not because I was punishing them, but because my grandmother had asked me to keep it, and I had said I would. And I did not make that kind of promise to someone I loved and then walk it back because the situation got complicated. My father said, "What are we supposed to do?" I said, "You are supposed to tell me the truth about your finances so I can actually help you, instead of building a weekend around getting me somewhere comfortable before asking for something I cannot give you." He did not have an answer for that. Neither did my mother. And I understood in that moment that they were not bad people. They were scared people who had learned a long time ago that the fastest solution to a problem was to aim it at me. They had not learned that from nowhere. I had taught them some of it myself, by always being the one who absorbed the impact without making them feel the cost. I left Sunday afternoon. The drive back to Chicago was the same 4 hours it always was. I called Thomas Vella on the road and told him what had happened. He said he would send a formal notice to Karen Whitfield's agency, confirming the trust's ownership status and the absence of any valid listing authorization. He said it would be on file by Tuesday. My mother called Wednesday. She did not mention Karen Whitfield or the developer or the folder my father had closed when I walked in. She asked how the drive home had been. I said fine. She asked if we could talk again soon. I said yes. That was 6 weeks ago. We have talked twice. They have not mentioned the house again. I do not know if that means they have accepted it or if they are simply finding a different approach. Either way, the trust is recorded, Thomas Vella has the files, and the county database shows exactly what it showed the day my grandmother sat at her kitchen table and asked me how to put the house somewhere safe. I have been back to the lake house once since that weekend. I went alone on a Tuesday and sat on the dock in the afternoon. The water was the same. The trees were the same. The dock had one board that needed replacing on the east side. I made a note to get it done before winter. My grandmother told me when I was 11 not to let them trade it for something smaller. I am keeping that promise. Here is what I know after 9 years of reading documents that decide what happens to things people love after they are gone. The people who protect you are not always the ones standing in front of you. Sometimes they are the ones who went to a lawyer 14 months before they died and asked a specific question and recorded the answer with the county and trusted you to show up when the time came. The time came. I showed up. If you have ever been the person in your family who was expected to absorb everything and say nothing, I see you. And if someone in your life prepared something quietly to protect you before you knew you would need it, tell me about them in the comments. Those are the stories I want to hear. Share this with someone who needs it. Subscribe if you have not already, and I will see you in the next one.